There is a story Cuba tells about itself that most of the world has simply accepted as settled history, that the island's indigenous Taíno population was wiped out within decades of Spanish arrival, reduced by disease, forced labor, and violence to functional extinction by the early 1500s, leaving modern Cuban identity to be built almost entirely from two ingredients: Spanish colonizers and enslaved Africans. It's a clean story, taught for generations, repeated in textbooks on both sides of the Florida Strait. It's also, according to the most comprehensive genetic study of the Cuban population ever conducted, not the full picture, and the part it leaves out shows up most clearly in exactly the kind of DNA that gets passed from mother to child. The historical backbone of the standard narrative is real enough. Spanish colonization of Cuba beginning in 1511 brought catastrophic mortality to the island's Taíno population through introduced disease, the brutal encomienda forced labor system, and violent suppression of resistance. A demographic collapse severe enough that Spanish administrators themselves, within a few generations, were writing about Cuba's indigenous population as effectively gone. That vacuum, combined with the later rise of Cuba's massive sugar economy, drove the large-scale importation of enslaved Africans, drawn from Yoruba, Akan, Congo, Igbo, and other West and Central African peoples, whose descendants make up the modern Afro-Cuban population, concentrated most heavily today in the island's eastern provinces. By the 20th century, Cuban national identity had largely settled into this two-root framework, Spanish and African, celebrated in Cuban music, religion, and popular culture as the twin foundations of the nation. Given how thoroughly documented Cuba's colonial-era demographic collapse is, you would reasonably expect a genetic study of the modern population to confirm the two-root story fairly cleanly, showing a population built overwhelmingly from Spanish and African sources with only trace, marginal evidence of the indigenous population colonial administrators had already declared extinct centuries ago. Before we get to what the data actually shows, it's worth sitting with how settled this assumption has felt for so long. This isn't a fringe theory anyone seriously contests. Cuba's indigenous extinction narrative has been the default academic and popular position for the better part of 2 centuries, repeated so consistently that a genetic study contradicting it would need to be unusually rigorous to be taken seriously at all. The 2014 study, led by researchers including Beatriz Marcheco-Teruel and published in PLOS Genetics, was exactly that rigorous. Analyzing autosomal, mitochondrial, and Y chromosome DNA from 1,019 individuals sampled across every province in Cuba, the study confirmed the broad two-root framework at the level of overall ancestry, finding the national population averaged 72% European, 20% African, and 8% Native American contribution. But when the researchers isolated the mitochondrial DNA specifically, the genetic material passed down exclusively through the maternal line, the picture shifted dramatically. Native American maternal haplotypes accounted for 34.5% of all mitochondrial lineages sampled nationwide, nearly matching the 38.8% found to be of African origin, and actually exceeding the 26.7% of Eurasian, meaning specifically European, maternal ancestry. Here's a question worth sitting with before we explain the gap. If the overall autosomal ancestry shows Native American contribution at a modest 8%, how does the maternal line-only data show a population that's over a third indigenous? The answer comes down to a strongly sex-biased pattern of colonial-era admixture, one that shows up clearly once researchers separate maternal from paternal inheritance. European ancestry in Cuba runs overwhelmingly through the paternal line. The genetic signature of Spanish men fathering children with indigenous and African women during and after colonization, while both Native American and African ancestry run disproportionately through the maternal line. Because autosomal DNA blends contributions from both parents roughly evenly across generations, the heavily male-skewed European contribution dilutes the overall percentage in a way that a purely maternal line analysis doesn't. The Native American population wasn't nearly as demographically erased as the standard narrative suggests. Its genetic legacy was carried forward specifically through women, generation after generation, in a way that autosomal averages alone had been quietly underrepresenting for decades before anyone thought to isolate the maternal data specifically. If a discrepancy like that, a national narrative built on one kind of genetic evidence while a completely different kind of DNA was telling a quieter, contradicting story the whole time, is the kind of gap you want to see this channel keep chasing. That's exactly why it's worth subscribing now, because we've found this same pattern of erased indigenous maternal survival in more than one population this series has covered, and there's likely another one waiting. And if you've ever heard a national origin story repeated so often, it stopped sounding like a claim and started sounding like settled fact, tell us in the comments, because those are usually exactly the stories worth checking against the genome directly. It's worth being specific about which West and Central African peoples this Afro-Cuban ancestry traces to, because the cultural record here is unusually well documented alongside the genetic one. Historical accounts and community self-identification point most consistently toward Yoruba, Akan, Arara, and Congo origins, alongside smaller documented contributions from Igbo, Karabali, Mandinga, and other groups. A diversity of source regions that shows up directly in Cuba's religious landscape today. Santeria's specific Orisha pantheon traces most directly to Yoruba cosmology, while separate traditions like Palo Monte draw more heavily on Congo spiritual practice, meaning Cuba's African-descended population didn't simply inherit one undifferentiated African heritage, but several distinct regional traditions that have remained separately identifiable in Cuban religious life for well over a century, each one a living thread back to a specific, documented point of departure, rather than a single, generalized African identity. There's a second layer to this data, just as striking as the maternal finding, and it has nothing to do with indigenous ancestry at all. When the 2014 study broke its results down province by province rather than presenting one national average, the African ancestry component swung wildly depending on region, from just 11% in Mayabeque province in the west to a full 40% in Guantanamo province in the east, with neighboring Santiago de Cuba close behind at 39%. That's not statistical noise. It's the genetic fingerprint of Cuba's own internal history. Eastern Cuba, the region historically called Oriente, was both the historical center of the island's sugar plantation economy and the primary destination for thousands of French planters and their enslaved laborers fleeing the Haitian Revolution at the turn of the 19th century. A wave of forced migration that concentrated African ancestry in the island's east, far more heavily than in Havana and the western provinces, a pattern still clearly legible in Cuban DNA more than 2 centuries later. It's worth adding one more comparative note here, because it places Cuba's maternal indigenous signal in useful context against a population this channel has already covered. Jamaica's maroon communities, profiled in an earlier episode, showed genetic evidence of Taíno-related ancestry surviving specifically within a small, historically isolated resistance community, the descendants of escaped enslaved Africans who built independent settlements in Jamaica's mountainous interior. Cuba's case is broader and, in some ways, more striking precisely because it isn't confined to one isolated group. The maternal indigenous signal shows up nationwide, across every province sampled, embedded in the general population rather than preserved only within a small, geographically isolated community that had reason to remain genetically separate from everyone else. That distinction matters. It suggests Cuba's indigenous maternal lineage didn't survive through isolation the way it may have in Jamaica's mountains. It survived through incorporation. Indigenous women and their descendants absorbed directly into the mainstream of colonial and post-colonial Cuban society. Their genetic legacy carried forward in plain sight rather than preserved at the margins, which may be part of why it went comparatively unnoticed for so long. A population hidden in the mountains invites the question of what it's hiding. A population fully integrated into the demographic mainstream rarely gets asked the same question at all. There's one more layer worth mentioning, because it shows this ancestry isn't just a historical artifact sitting quietly in the genome, but something with measurable consequences today. A separate genetic study examining dengue fever outcomes in Cuba found that African ancestry specifically correlates with protection against the disease's severe hemorrhagic form, with researchers using Cuba's uniquely high level of population admixture to map the specific genetic regions responsible, a finding that places Cuba alongside several other populations this channel has profiled, where African-derived genetic variants turned out to carry a direct, measurable survival advantage against a locally significant disease, encoded quietly in DNA, long before modern medicine had any way of detecting it. For Afro-Cubans and Cubans broadly today, this layered genetic history sits alongside a culture that has always publicly celebrated its African roots more prominently than its indigenous ones, most visibly through Santeria, the Yoruba-derived religious tradition practiced widely across the island, regardless of formal racial identification, and through Cuban musical traditions carrying direct, traceable West and Central African rhythmic structures. The indigenous thread, by contrast, has largely been treated as a closed historical chapter rather than a living inheritance, even though the maternal DNA data suggests it never actually closed the way the textbooks claimed. What the genome adds isn't a contradiction of Cuba's African heritage, which the data thoroughly confirms, and which Cuban culture has never needed a laboratory to validate. It's a quiet correction to the other half of the story, the half that got declared finished centuries before the evidence to properly check it ever existed. What makes the Cuban case a valuable addition to this series is how cleanly it demonstrates a pattern this channel keeps rediscovering in new forms. A population's own national story, built and repeated for generations, can be simultaneously true in one respect and quietly incomplete in another, with the gap between the two sitting exactly where nobody thought to look, until someone finally separated the DNA by which parent it came from. Cuba was never simply Spanish and African. It just took mitochondrial DNA to make the third root visible again, carried forward the entire time by mothers the official record had already stopped counting. That's not a small correction to make to a national story 2 centuries in the making. It's a reminder that the version of history written down first isn't always the version the genome eventually agrees to confirm, and that sometimes the most overlooked ancestry isn't the one hidden furthest away, but the one standing in plain sight, waiting for someone to finally check which parent it came through.